Greetings and welcome to the fifth and what I hope will be the last mini lecture. I got quite a bit of text to try to cover in this mini lecture, but some of the information in your notes I've already covered. So I'm going to look at what I think are some of the more important themes. I talked about some of the specific themes in the previous mini lecture. And so if you look at your notes, I think a huge theme, and Roskin certainly emphasizes this. There's no question in my mind that he's right about this one. In both the United States and in Great Britain, there has been a de-alignment of the electorate. In other words, in both countries, voters are losing their loyalty to the two major parties. In the United States, we're seeing more independence, for example. In Britain, we're seeing more support for the nationalist parties. And we've seen kind of consistent support for the liberal Democrats. Now, one of the areas where I think Roskin misleads you a little bit is he makes it sound that like this is a recent phenomenon, and it isn't. For example, if you look at elections in the early 1950s, really until the mid 1960s, typically in Great Britain, over 90% of British voters cast ballots for the two major parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And I gave you some statistics. In 1951, it was 96.8%. In 1955, 96%. 1959, 93%. It fell, but not much. In the 1960s, it was still 87.4%. In 1964, 87%. In 1966. Now, notice that by 2010, the support for the two major parties had fell to a low of 65%. And notice that was the first time that there was a coalition government in Britain in the modern era over the last 4 decades or so. It has rebounded a little bit, and as I have pointed out in the notes, is back up to a little over 75% in 2019. But given the support for the nationalist parties in Ireland and Wales and in Scotland, we're never going to get back to those days where Britain really looked a lot like the United States. If you took a look at voting patterns in the 1950s, I'd even claim in the 1960s, Britain was really a strict two-party system, but has been a two-plus party system for quite a while. Another concept that Roskin talks about in detail, and I agree with him, is there really is responsible party government in Britain. Voting for a party in Britain has very clear policy consequences. I would agree with Roskin that both party image, that is, how voters perceive political parties in Britain, and their psychological attachment, which he calls party identification, are very strong in Britain. The way that I would summarize what he was trying to tell you is voters know what the parties stand for, and most voters identify with a political party because of that mental image of party. Three, in Britain, I really believe there is a very strong fear by British politicians of electoral punishment. So if I ask you on the exam, what what is Carl Friedrich's or what is Friedrich's rule of anticipated reactions? What's the significance of that? The significance is that this is what keeps politicians honest: fear of electoral punishment. They try to make sure that they stay fairly close to the sentiment of voters in order to get reelected. In both Britain and in the United States, I would argue or I would claim that the real goal is to mobilize your party's voters. It's not very likely. From time to time, you can scrape off some voters. I know in the United States, for example, commentators will talk about Reagan Democrats, how Reagan was able to appeal to blue collar Democrats. and that's why he was able to win such decisive landslides. That he not only mobilized his own voters, but he was able to mobilize voters of the other party and get them to switch or give up their loyalty on their party, at least for that election. It does occur occasionally, usually during great events. For example, when the Great Depression hit in America, a lot of Republicans gave up on their party and became Democrats. But usually what swings elections in Britain is which party is more effective in getting their people to the polls. And I know that is increasingly becoming true in the United States. I pointed out some specifics, but I do want to point out something that I left out. I talked about the 1983 election earlier in Britain, where the Liberal Democrats received nearly the same amount of votes as the Labour Party, but I left something important out. In Britain, uh, there was a perception by the more conservative wing of the Labour Party that they were being ignored, that the left wing of the party was dominant. And so a lot of moderates gave up on their party and joined the Social Democrats and formed this new party called the Liberal Democratic Party. Now, Tony Blair was able to eventually become leader of the Labor Party. He moved the party back to the center, just as Bill Clinton did in the United States, and he was able to get many of them back. And he was able to lead Labor to three straight victories in 1997, 2001, and 2005 as the leader of their political party. But this is the great peril for parties. Right now, for example, there's a lot of discussion about the split in the Republican Party in America between populists who are huge fans and devoted to Donald Trump and more traditional conservatives who believe that this is dangerous, that the party has given up on their values and their principles to worship this personality, and there's some fear that there might be a split in the Republican Party. I am not so sure that that's going to happen. Obviously, if it did, if that wing of the Republican Party were to leave, um, then I think the results for the Republican Party would be disastrous. If that party splits into two wings, the Democrats are going to win huge victories. And of course, that's what happened in Britain when the moderate wing of Labor split away and formed the Liberal Democratic Party. Notice that the person who benefited was Margaret Thatcher. Take a look at how many seats the conservatives picked up. And of course, the conservatives were also able to win in 1987 and in 1992. They won four consecutive elections. It was the first time a party had done this in 150 years, and it was because Labor was disunited and they split the party. So I think there is a question on, you know, that there was a split in which political party that strengthened the Liberal Democratic Party, and that would be the Labor Party, is the party that split in the early 80s. I talked a bit earlier about the 2010 election, how it was different from elections before it. This is the last election that Roskin talks about in the chapter. Labor had been in office for 13 years. The conservatives won the election, but for the first time in a long, long time, no party had a majority of the seats. And the result was they had to form a coalition government, which they did with the Liberal Democrats. Um, and the result was disastrous for the Liberal Democrats. And I talked about that election in some detail, so you can read it in your notes. I really liked an observation in the chapter. Roskin talks about how region trumps class in voting today in England. For example, if you take a look in 2010, your book points out the Conservatives did best in England and large cities voted Labor. Certainly, region is very important. If you take a look at American elections in American large cities, they vote Democrat, rural areas Republican. If you look at New England and West Coast states, they voted Democrat. If you take a look at the South and Midwest, they voted overwhelmingly Republican. So, what happened after Roskin's book was published? I talked a bit about this. In 2015, Cameron was able to lead the Conservatives to a narrow victory. He needed 326 seats to form a government and barely got it with 330. And you might think, gosh, that resembles the U.S. Congress today. The Democrats have a razor thin majority in the House, and the Senate is split right down the middle, 50-50. I told you that there was a referendum on Brexit. Cameron lost the vote. He resigned. May became the new prime minister in 2017. May called for early elections, claiming, and I think it was baloney, that she was calling for early elections to strengthen her hand in Brexit negotiations. It's not true. The reason that she called for early elections was polls showed she had a 21% lead in the polls, and she thought that she would not only get more votes, but that she would now have a 5-year term that would start fresh. And of course, Blair did it successfully, Thatcher did it successfully. But in Theresa May's case, calling for early elections backfired. Her party actually picked up a significant amount of votes in the election, but Labor gained even more votes. And the result was, even though the Conservatives got a plurality of the vote, she was forced into a coalition government, as I pointed out, with the Democratic Unionist Party. May ended up resigning after the Conservatives did poorly in parliamentary elections and was replaced with the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I probably will ask who is the current Prime Minister of Britain, so you should know it's Boris Johnson. The 2019 election looked like a normal election. The Conservatives won a decisive victory with 43.6% of the vote, a plurality of the vote, and they ended up with a strong majority in the Commons, 365. And remember, 326 is a majority. Labor had an awful showing. I think I told you earlier that in the last election, it was the lowest seat total for the Labor Party since 1935. You will notice in the notes that those regional patterns that Roskin talked about are true with a little bit of a variation, right? The Conservatives, as always, ran strongest in England. The Labour Party ran strongest in Wales. The Scottish Nationalist Party ran strongest in Scotland. And the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, ran strongest in Northern Ireland. Turnout was a little below average, although it was up from 2017 at 67.3%. If you take a look at most of the elections from 1979 through 2019, most of them are in the mid 70s, with 75% about average. For me, the most interesting voter data from the last election was the link between age and voting, which was completely ignored by Roskin in earlier elections. For example, 18 to 24-year-olds, young people, Labor got 62% of the vote. Conservatives only got 19%. For old farts like me, for voters 65 and over, although I'm only 62 and a half, the Conservatives got 64% and Labor 17%. As your notes point out, what's interesting is in every age cohort, the older the British voter got, the more conservative the vote total. And that's something that I think is traditionally true in the United States as well. We will turn away from British politics and elections. I'll talk a little bit about political culture, and I will finish Britain with public policy.